How a failed video game led to the creation of Slack. Welcome to Small Cause Big Effect, where we explore the unexpected ways that failure becomes the foundation for extraordinary success. I'm your host, and today we're diving into one of the most fascinating pivot stories in tech history. How a video game that nobody wanted to play accidentally created the workplace communication tool that revolutionized how millions of people collaborate every single day. This is the story of Stewart Butterfield, a philosophy major turned entrepreneur who spent years building what he thought would be the next great online game, only to discover that the real innovation wasn't in the game itself. It was in the tool his team had created just to talk to each other while building it. By 2021, that accidental communication tool had sold to Salesforce for $27.7 billion, making it one of the largest software acquisitions in history. But in 2012, Stewart Butterfield was just a guy whose video game company was running out of money, running out of time, and running out of hope. The game was called Glitch, and it was supposed to be magical, a whimsical online world where players could collaborate, create, and explore together. Instead, it became one of the most expensive lessons in Silicon Valley history about the difference between building what you think people want and discovering what they actually need. But here's where the story gets interesting, and why it perfectly embodies the theme of our show. The failure of Glitch wasn't really a failure at all. It was the small cause that created one of the biggest effects in modern workplace technology. Because while Stewart's team was failing to build a successful game, they were accidentally succeeding at solving a problem that every company in the world desperately needed solved. Act 1. The philosophy major's unlikely path. From Kant to Code. To understand how Stewart Butterfield ended up accidentally revolutionizing workplace communication, we need to start with an unlikely beginning. A philosophy and cognitive science major at the University of Victoria who never intended to become a tech entrepreneur at all. Stewart wasn't one of those child prodigies who started coding at age 8 or built computers in their garage. He was studying the nature of human consciousness, the structure of language, and the fundamental questions of how minds work and how people communicate with each other. These might seem like abstract academic pursuits, but they were actually the perfect preparation for what he would eventually build. You see, philosophy teaches you to think about problems from first principles, to question assumptions that everyone else takes for granted, and to look for underlying patterns that might not be immediately obvious. Cognitive science teaches you to understand how humans actually process information, make decisions, and interact with complex systems. These weren't technical skills, but they were the conceptual foundation that would eventually allow Stewart to see opportunities that pure technologists might miss. While other entrepreneurs were focused on building faster processes or more efficient algorithms, Stewart was thinking about how technology could better serve the way humans naturally want to work and communicate. After graduation, Stewart did what many philosophy majors do when they're not quite ready for the corporate world. He traveled, explored different ideas, and tried to figure out what he actually wanted to do with his life. But even during this exploratory phase, he was drawn to the intersection of technology and human behavior. This led him to his first real venture into the tech world, but not in the way you might expect. In 2002, Stewart co-founded a company called Corp with his then-wife, Katerina Fake. They were trying to build an online game, but they kept getting distracted by a side project, a photo-sharing feature that players could use to document their gaming experiences. That photo-sharing side project eventually became Flickr, one of the pioneering social media platforms that changed how people shared and discovered images online. Yahoo acquired Flickr in 2005 for a reported $35 million, which was a substantial success for a company that had started as a gaming venture. Now, most entrepreneurs would have taken that exit as validation of their approach and continued building similar products. But Stewart learned something different from the Flickr experience. He learned that sometimes the most valuable thing you build isn't what you set out to build at all. The game that Corp had originally intended to create never became successful. But the communication and sharing tools they built to support that game became the foundation for a platform that millions of people used and loved. This was Stewart's first lesson in what would become a recurring pattern, paying attention to the tools and processes that emerge organically when you're solving real problems, even if those problems aren't the ones you thought you were trying to solve. After the Flickr acquisition, Stewart spent a few years at Yahoo, learning how large technology companies operate and thinking about what he wanted to build next. The experience was valuable, but it also reinforced his belief that the most interesting innovations happen when small teams have the freedom to experiment, fail, and discover unexpected solutions. By 2009, Stewart was ready to start something new. He had learned from Flickr that great products often emerge from the intersection of gaming, communication, and human behavior. He had access to funding from his previous success, and he had a vision for creating something that would combine the collaborative aspects of gaming with the social connection that had made Flickr successful. That vision became a company called Tiny Speck, and their mission was to build the most innovative online game the world had ever seen. They called it Glitch, and for the next 3 years, it would consume every ounce of Stewart's energy, creativity, and resources while teaching him the most expensive and valuable lessons of his entrepreneurial career. Act 2. The Ambitious Game. Building Glitch in a World of Warcraft. When Stewart Butterfield started Tiny Speck in 2009, the online gaming landscape was dominated by a few massive successes and countless failures. World of Warcraft had over 11 million subscribers and was generating billions in revenue. Casual games like Farmville were attracting tens of millions of players on Facebook. The gaming industry was huge, profitable, and seemed to offer unlimited potential for innovation. Stewart's vision for Glitch was ambitious and different. Instead of building another combat-focused game where players fought monsters and accumulated power, he wanted to create a collaborative world where players would work together to solve puzzles, build communities, and explore a whimsical universe filled with strange creatures and unexpected interactions. The concept was beautiful in its idealism. Players would inhabit a world where cooperation was more valuable than competition, where creativity mattered more than combat skills, and where the social interactions between players were just as important as the game mechanics themselves. It was like combining the community aspects of social media with the engagement of gaming and the collaborative potential of the early internet. Stewart assembled a team of incredibly talented designers, developers, and artists to bring this vision to life. They raised millions of dollars in funding from respected venture capital firms who believed in the potential of this new kind of online experience. They spent months crafting every detail of the game world, from the visual art style to the complex systems that would govern how players interacted with each other and the environment. But as anyone who has ever tried to build a successful game will tell you, there's an enormous difference between having a compelling vision and creating something that millions of people actually want to play regularly. Games are one of the most difficult products to get right because they have to be immediately engaging, continuously rewarding, and socially compelling all at the same time. Glitch faced several fundamental challenges that became more apparent as development progressed. First, the collaborative, non-competitive gameplay that Stewart envisioned required a level of social coordination that was difficult to achieve with strangers on the internet. Players needed to trust each other, communicate effectively, and work toward shared goals, behaviors that don't emerge naturally in most online environments. Second, the game's complexity made it difficult for new players to understand what they were supposed to do or why they should care. While World of Warcraft could rely on familiar fantasy tropes and clear progression systems, Glitch required players to learn an entirely new set of social and mechanical rules without obvious real-world analogies. Third, and perhaps most importantly, the gaming market was becoming increasingly competitive and hit-driven. Players had limited time and attention, and they were choosing to spend it on games that provided immediate gratification and clear social validation. Glitch's more contemplative, collaborative approach required a level of patience and investment that many players weren't willing to make. But here's where the story becomes really interesting. Because while Stewart and his team were struggling to solve these game design challenges, they were inadvertently solving a completely different problem that was much more universal and urgent. Building a complex online game with a distributed team requires an enormous amount of coordination, communication, and collaboration. Team members need to share ideas, provide feedback, track progress, make decisions, and stay aligned on vision and priorities. In 2010, the tools available for this kind of work were fragmented, frustrating, and inadequate for the pace and complexity of modern software development. Email was too slow and formal for quick conversations. Instant messaging was too ephemeral and disorganized for important discussions. Project management tools were too rigid for creative work. Video calls were too disruptive for the kind of ongoing, asynchronous communication that distributed teams needed. So Stewart's team did what many innovative companies do when existing tools don't meet their needs. They built their own solution. They created a simple internal communication system that allowed them to have ongoing conversations organized by topic, share files and links easily, and maintain a searchable history of all their discussions and decisions. This internal tool wasn't meant to be a product. It was just a utility to help them build their game more effectively. But as they used it day after day, month after month, they began to realize that they had accidentally solved a problem that was much more important and universal than the game they were trying to create. Act 3. The accidental innovation. Building the tool to build the game. While Stewart Butterfield and his team at Tiny Speck were struggling to make Glitch commercially viable, something remarkable was happening in their day-to-day work experience. The internal communication tool they had built was transforming not just how they worked, but how they felt about working. Think about this for a moment. Here was a team of creative professionals trying to solve complex problems, coordinate across different time zones, and maintain creative momentum on a project that required constant collaboration and iteration. Before their internal tool, these conversations were scattered across email threads, instant messages, and conference calls that left no permanent record and were difficult to search or reference later. But with their homegrown communication system, something magical started happening. Conversations became more focused and productive because they were organized by topic rather than chronology. Ideas weren't lost because everything was automatically saved and searchable. Team members could contribute to discussions asynchronously, which meant that the best ideas could emerge over time rather than being limited to whoever was available for a specific meeting. Most importantly, the tool created a sense of shared presence and continuity that made remote work feel more connected and collaborative than most in-person offices. Team members could see what everyone else was working on, jump into conversations when they had relevant expertise, and maintain awareness of project progress without constant status meetings. Now, here's where Stewart's background in philosophy and cognitive science became invaluable. While most people might have noticed that their internal tool was useful and left it at that, Stewart had the conceptual framework to understand why it was working so well, and whether those principles could be applied more broadly. The tool wasn't just solving a technical problem. It was addressing fundamental issues in how humans process information, maintain social connections, and coordinate complex activities. It was making visible the normally invisible work of communication and collaboration, and it was doing so in a way that felt natural and engaging rather than bureaucratic and burdensome. Stewart began to realize that while Glitch was struggling to find its audience, their internal communication tool was solving a problem that virtually every knowledge worker in the world experienced every single day. The market for better workplace communication was enormous, underserved, and growing rapidly as more companies adopted remote work and distributed teams. But recognizing an opportunity is very different from deciding to pursue it, especially when you've already invested years of work and millions of dollars into a different vision. Stewart faced the classic entrepreneur's dilemma. Do you persist with your original plan despite mounting evidence that it isn't working? Or do you pivot to a new opportunity that requires abandoning everything you've built so far? This decision was made even more difficult by the fact that Glitch wasn't a complete failure. The game had attracted a small but passionate community of players who loved its unique approach to online gaming. These players were devastated when Stewart announced that Glitch would be shutting down, and some of them continued to advocate for the game's revival years later. But Stewart had learned from his Flickr experience that sometimes the most valuable thing you can build emerges from the process of building something else. The internal communication tool wasn't a distraction from their real work. It was the real work that had been hiding behind their original intentions. In 2012, Stewart made one of the most difficult decisions of his entrepreneurial career. He shut down Glitch, refunded money to players, and announced that Tiny Speck would be pivoting to focus entirely on the communication tool that had emerged from their game development process. This wasn't just a business decision. It was a fundamental shift in how Stewart thought about innovation and value creation. Instead of trying to impose his vision on the market, he was choosing to listen to what the market was actually telling him through the organic adoption and enthusiasm that his team had experienced with their internal tool. The communication tool that would eventually become Slack wasn't born from market research or competitive analysis. It was born from the authentic experience of a team trying to solve real problems in their daily work and discovering that the solutions they created for themselves were more valuable than the product they were originally trying to build. This is a perfect example of what we mean when we talk about small causes creating big effects. The decision to build a simple internal communication tool seemed like a minor utility project compared to the ambitious game they were developing. But that small cause, the need for better team communication, would eventually create a much bigger effect than Glitch ever could have achieved. Act 4. The birth of Slack. From internal tool to industry revolution. When Stewart Butterfield announced the shutdown of Glitch in late 2012, he faced a challenge that many entrepreneurs know all too well. How do you convince investors, employees, and the broader tech community that your new direction is worth pursuing when your previous direction was such a visible failure? This is where Stewart's experience with the Flickr pivot became invaluable. He had been through this process before and understood that the key to a successful pivot isn't just having a better idea. It's being able to articulate why the new direction addresses a more fundamental and universal need than your original plan. Stewart's pitch for what would become Slack was elegantly simple and powerfully compelling. Every company in the world has teams that need to communicate and collaborate effectively. The existing tools for workplace communication were fragmented, inefficient, and actively harmful to productivity and team morale. The solution wasn't another incremental improvement to email or instant messaging. It was a completely new approach that made team communication more organized, searchable, and engaging. But perhaps the most compelling part of Stewart's pitch was that they already had proof that this approach worked. His team at Tiny Speck had been using their internal tool for over a year, and it had genuinely transformed how they worked together. They weren't asking investors to bet on a theoretical solution. They were asking them to bet on a proven approach that could be scaled to serve teams everywhere. The early development of Slack was guided by several key principles that distinguished it from existing workplace communication tools. First, conversations would be organized into channels based on topics, projects, or teams, rather than being mixed together in a single inbox like email. This made it easy to follow specific discussions without being overwhelmed by irrelevant information. Second, everything would be searchable and persistent, which meant that important information wouldn't be lost when someone left the company or when conversations moved to different platforms. The entire history of team communication would become a searchable knowledge base that got more valuable over time. Third, the tool would integrate seamlessly with other workplace applications so that teams could see updates from project management systems, code repositories, customer support tickets, and other business tools without having to constantly switch between different applications. But the most important principle was something that Stewart's team called human-centered design. This meant that every feature and design decision would be evaluated based on how it affected the human experience of work, not just technical efficiency or business metrics. For example, Slack introduced features like custom emoji, animated GIFs, and playful notification sounds that might seem frivolous in a business context, but actually served an important psychological function. They made workplace communication feel more personal, expressive, and enjoyable, which encouraged people to communicate more openly and frequently. This attention to the emotional and social aspects of workplace communication was revolutionary in the enterprise software world, where most tools were designed with a purely functional approach that ignored how technology affects workplace culture and employee satisfaction. The name Slack itself reflected this human-centered philosophy. It stood for searchable log of all conversation and knowledge, but the word Slack also suggested a more relaxed, informal approach to workplace communication. It implied that work didn't have to be rigid, formal, or stressful to be productive and professional. Stewart and his team spent the first half of 2013 rebuilding their internal communication tool as a commercial product, incorporating lessons from their own usage and feedback from a small group of beta testers. The challenge was maintaining the simplicity and elegance that made their internal tool so effective while adding the features, security, and reliability that enterprise customers would require. By August 2013, Slack was ready for its public launch. Stewart's team had created a product that they genuinely believed could transform how teams communicate and collaborate. But they also knew that changing workplace behavior is one of the most difficult challenges in technology. People are resistant to adopting new tools, especially for something as fundamental as how they talk to their colleagues. The question was whether other teams would have the same transformative experience with Slack that Stewart's team had experienced with their internal tool, or whether the magic would be lost in translation from a small, tight-knit game development team to the diverse, complex world of modern workplaces. Act 5. The Viral Workplace Revolution. Why everyone started slacking. When Slack officially launched in August 2013, Stewart Butterfield and his team did something that was almost unheard of in enterprise software. They focused on making their product so good that it would spread organically through word of mouth, rather than relying on traditional sales and marketing approaches. This strategy was risky because enterprise software sales typically require lengthy evaluation processes, formal procurement procedures, and extensive customization for each client. Most companies expect to be sold to through dedicated sales teams, detailed product demonstrations, and comprehensive service agreements. But Stewart had a different theory about how workplace software adoption actually happens in the modern economy. He believed that the best tools spread from the bottom up through individual employees and small teams who discover something that makes their work significantly better and then advocate for broader adoption within their organizations. This bottom-up adoption model had worked for consumer technologies like smartphones and social media, but it was relatively untested in the enterprise software market. Stewart was betting that if Slack genuinely made people's work lives better, they would become advocates for the product without any external incentive or pressure. The results exceeded even Stewart's optimistic projections. Within 24 hours of launch, Slack had over 8,000 signups. Within a week, they had over 15,000 users. Within their first month, they had processed over 500,000 messages and were adding thousands of new users every day. But what was even more remarkable than the raw growth numbers was the pattern of how people were using Slack. Teams weren't just trying it out and moving on. They were fundamentally changing how they worked and communicating in ways that made them more productive, more connected, and more satisfied with their daily work experience. Early Slack users reported that they were sending fewer emails, having shorter meetings, making faster decisions, and feeling more connected to their colleagues and projects. Remote team members felt less isolated, new employees got up to speed more quickly, and important information stopped falling through the cracks between different communication channels. These weren't just incremental improvements. They were qualitative changes in workplace culture and collaboration. Teams that adopted Slack weren't just communicating more efficiently. They were working in fundamentally different ways that made them more creative, responsive, and aligned around shared goals. The viral growth continued throughout 2014 and 2015, with Slack adding millions of users and thousands of organizations without any traditional advertising or outbound sales efforts. The product was selling itself through the authentic enthusiasm of people whose work lives had been genuinely improved. This organic growth pattern validated Stewart's core insight about workplace communication. The problem wasn't that existing tools were slightly inefficient. The problem was that they were actively harmful to how people naturally want to work and collaborate. Slack wasn't just a better email client or instant messaging system. It was a completely different approach to workplace communication that aligned with how humans actually process information and maintain social connections. By 2015, Slack had become more than just a communication tool. It had become a platform that integrated with hundreds of other workplace applications and services. Teams could see updates from their project management systems, customer support tickets, code repositories, and business analytics tools, all within the same interface where they were having conversations about work. This integration approach meant that Slack was becoming the central nervous system for how teams stayed informed about and coordinated their work activities. Instead of constantly switching between different applications and trying to maintain context across multiple systems, teams could work from a single interface that brought together all the information and communication they needed. The platform approach also created a network effect that made Slack more valuable as more teams adopted it. Each new integration made the platform more useful for everyone, and each new team that joined brought their own workflows and requirements that drove further innovation and development. Now, if you're fascinated by this story of how a failed video game accidentally created one of the most successful workplace tools in history, you're going to love what we explore every week here at Small Cause Big Effect. We dive deep into these incredible transformation stories where failure becomes the foundation for extraordinary success. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications because these stories of unexpected innovation and pivotal moments will change how you think about failure, adaptation, and recognizing opportunity in disguise. Act 6. The Enterprise Transformation. From startup tool to corporate standard. By 2016, Slack faced a challenge that many rapidly growing technology companies encounter. How do you maintain the simplicity and user experience that made your product successful while adding the features, security, and reliability that large enterprise customers require? This challenge was particularly complex for Slack because their competitive advantage was based on being more human-centered and user-friendly than existing enterprise communication tools. Adding traditional enterprise features like advanced security controls, administrative dashboards, and compliance reporting could easily compromise the simplicity and elegance that made Slack appealing in the first place. Stewart and his team approached this challenge with the same design philosophy that had guided Slack from the beginning. Every new feature had to enhance rather than complicate the core user experience. Instead of building separate administrative interfaces that only IT departments would use, they integrated enterprise features into the same interface that end users experienced every day. For example, instead of requiring administrators to manage user permissions through complex configuration screens, Slack made it possible to control access and security through the same channel and conversation interfaces that teams were already using for daily communication. This meant that enterprise features felt like natural extensions of the product rather than burdensome add-ons. This approach to enterprise features was revolutionary in the business software world, where most vendors treated user experience and administrative functionality as completely separate concerns. Enterprise software was traditionally designed to meet the requirements of IT departments and procurement committees, with the assumption that end users would adapt to whatever system was chosen for them. Slack demonstrated that this assumption was wrong and counterproductive. When enterprise software was designed with the same attention to user experience as consumer products, organizations saw higher adoption rates, better compliance with security policies, and more productive use of the technology they were paying for. The results were dramatic and measurable. Companies that switched from traditional communication tools to Slack reported significant improvements in project completion times, employee satisfaction scores, and overall organizational agility. Teams could respond to changes more quickly. New employees could contribute more effectively, and important information was less likely to be lost or overlooked. These organizational benefits attracted the attention of some of the world's largest and most sophisticated companies. By 2017, Slack was being used by teams at IBM, Target, Capital One, and hundreds of other Fortune 500 companies that had previously relied on traditional enterprise communication systems. But perhaps the most significant validation of Slack's approach came from technology companies that understood both the technical and cultural challenges of workplace communication. Companies like Airbnb, Spotify, and Netflix, organizations known for their innovative workplace cultures and technical excellence, chose Slack as their primary communication platform. This enterprise adoption created a virtuous cycle that accelerated Slack's growth and development. Large customers provided feedback that helped improve the product for everyone, generated revenue that funded continued innovation, and served as case studies that made it easier for other organizations to justify adopting Slack. By 2018, Slack had fundamentally changed the workplace communication software market. Traditional enterprise communication vendors like Microsoft and Cisco were scrambling to add Slack-like features to their existing products, while new competitors were emerging with their own attempts to replicate Slack's success. But Stewart and his team had learned from their glitch experience that having a great product isn't enough. You also need to continue innovating and evolving to stay ahead of both changing user needs and competitive responses. Slack continued to add new features, integrations, and capabilities that made the platform more valuable for different types of teams and use cases. The company also continued to grow through both organic user adoption and strategic acquisitions of complementary technologies. Each acquisition brought new capabilities to the Slack platform, while maintaining the design principles and user experience philosophy that had made Slack successful in the first place. By 2019, Slack was ready to go public, transitioning from a private company funded by venture capital to a public company accountable to shareholders and the broader investment community. The IPO was successful and validated the enormous value that Slack had created by solving a universal workplace problem that had been ignored or inadequately addressed by existing technology companies. Act 7. The ultimate validation. The $27.70 billion acquisition. In December 2020, Salesforce announced that it would acquire Slack for $27.7 billion, making it one of the largest software acquisitions in history. This wasn't just a financial transaction, it was the ultimate validation of Stewart Butterfield's vision that workplace communication could be fundamentally reimagined and improved. To understand the significance of this acquisition, we need to consider what Salesforce was buying and why they were willing to pay such an enormous price. Salesforce wasn't just acquiring Slack's technology or user base, they were acquiring a completely different approach to how businesses think about internal communication and collaboration. Salesforce had built their business around customer relationship management, helping companies manage their interactions with customers and prospects. But they recognized that internal communication and collaboration were becoming just as important as external customer relationships in determining business success. The COVID-19 pandemic had accelerated the adoption of remote work and distributed teams, making tools like Slack essential infrastructure for how modern businesses operate. Companies that had effective internal communication systems were able to adapt more quickly to changing conditions, while companies with poor communication tools struggled to maintain productivity and coordination. But the acquisition was about more than just responding to pandemic-driven changes in workplace behavior. Salesforce understood that Slack represented a fundamental shift in how software companies think about user experience, product design, and customer success. Traditional enterprise software companies had focused on building features that would impress procurement committees and IT departments, often at the expense of the actual user experience. Slack had demonstrated that enterprise software could be as intuitive, engaging, and user-friendly as consumer products, and that this approach led to better business outcomes for customers. This user-centered design philosophy aligned perfectly with Salesforce's own approach to building business software that people actually wanted to use. The combination of Salesforce's customer relationship management platform with Slack's internal communication and collaboration tools created the potential for a comprehensive business communication platform that could serve both internal and external needs. For Stewart Butterfield personally, the acquisition represented the culmination of a journey that had started with a failed video game and evolved into one of the most successful enterprise software stories in history. The philosophy major, who had never intended to become a tech entrepreneur, had created a product that fundamentally changed how millions of people experienced work every day. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of Stewart's story is how it demonstrates the power of paying attention to unintended consequences and emergent solutions. The internal communication tool that became Slack wasn't planned or strategically designed. It emerged organically from the real needs of a team trying to solve difficult problems together. This pattern of accidental innovation is more common than most people realize, but it requires a particular kind of entrepreneurial mindset to recognize and pursue these opportunities. You have to be willing to abandon your original plans when evidence suggests that something else might be more valuable. And you have to be humble enough to let the market tell you what it actually needs rather than insisting on your preconceived notions. The Slack story also illustrates the importance of understanding human psychology and social dynamics in addition to technical capabilities. Stewart's background in philosophy and cognitive science gave him insights into how people actually process information, make decisions, and maintain social connections that pure technologists might have missed. The features that made Slack successful, channel-based organization, persistent searchable history, seamless integrations, and playful human-centered design, weren't just technical innovations. They were psychological and social innovations that made workplace communication more aligned with how humans naturally want to interact and collaborate. This combination of technical excellence and human-centered design became a template that influenced how many other software companies approach product development. The idea that enterprise software should be as intuitive and engaging as consumer products is now widely accepted, but it was revolutionary when Slack first demonstrated its effectiveness. Conclusion: the small cause that transformed work. So let's return to where this story began, with a philosophy major who set out to build a whimsical online game and ended up accidentally creating one of the most important workplace tools of the modern era. The small cause in this story wasn't Stewart Butterfield's decision to pivot from Glitch to Slack. The small cause was the much simpler decision to build an internal communication tool that would help his team work together more effectively while they were developing their game. That simple, practical decision, born out of necessity rather than strategic planning, ended up solving a problem that affected millions of knowledge workers around the world. The tool that was supposed to help build a better game ended up building better workplaces instead. This is what we mean when we talk about small causes creating big effects. The most transformative innovations often emerge not from grand strategic visions, but from people trying to solve immediate, practical problems in their daily work and life. Stewart's story teaches us several important lessons about innovation, entrepreneurship, and recognizing opportunity. First, failure isn't the opposite of success. It's often the necessary precursor to success. The failure of Glitch wasn't a setback. It was the context that allowed the real innovation to emerge and be recognized. Second, the most valuable problems to solve are often the ones you experience directly in your own work or life. Stewart and his team weren't trying to address a theoretical market opportunity with Slack. They were solving a communication problem that was making their own work more difficult and less enjoyable. Third, paying attention to the tools and processes that emerge organically while you're working on something else can be more valuable than the original project itself. The willingness to pivot based on what you learn through direct experience rather than persisting with preconceived plans is a crucial entrepreneurial skill. Fourth, Understanding human psychology and social dynamics is just as important as technical capabilities when building products that people will actually use and value. Stewart's background in philosophy and cognitive science gave him insights that purely technical entrepreneurs might have missed. And finally, the best solutions often feel obvious in retrospect, but require genuine insight and courage to recognize and pursue when they first emerge. The idea that workplace communication could be more organized, searchable, and engaging seems obvious now, but it was revolutionary when Slack first demonstrated its effectiveness. The garage where Amazon started and the bedroom where Zoom was born have become famous symbols of entrepreneurial ambition and persistence. Stewart Butterfield's office at Tiny Speck represents something equally important: the power of accidental innovation and the willingness to recognize opportunity in unexpected places. The communication tool that was supposed to help build a game ended up changing how millions of people experience work every day. The failed video game company became the foundation for one of the most successful enterprise software stories in history. Before we wrap up today's episode, I want to speak directly to anyone who's working on something that isn't going according to plan, or anyone who's noticed that the tools and processes you've created to solve one problem might actually be more valuable than the original problem you were trying to solve. Stewart Butterfield's story shows us that sometimes the most important innovations are hiding in plain sight, waiting for someone with the insight to recognize their potential and the courage to pursue them. If this story has you thinking differently about failure, adaptation, and recognizing hidden opportunities, then you're exactly the kind of person who belongs in this community. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and join the thousands of listeners who are learning to see these transformational moments in their own work and life. Because your failed project might be hiding the next billion-dollar innovation, and your small cause might be about to create a very big effect. The philosophy major who never intended to become a tech entrepreneur ended up revolutionizing how people communicate at work. The video game that nobody wanted to play became the foundation for a communication platform that millions of people use every day. And maybe that's the most important lesson from Stewart's story: the value of staying curious about problems that affect your daily experience, remaining open to unexpected solutions, and having the courage to pursue opportunities that emerge from failure rather than success. That's it for today's episode of Small Cause, Big Effect. Remember, the next time someone tells you that your project isn't working or that you should stick to your original plan, consider whether you might be solving a more important problem than the one you thought you were working on. The difference between a failed video game and a $27.7 billion communication platform was just one entrepreneur's willingness to pay attention to what was actually working rather than what was supposed to work. Until next time, keep experimenting, keep failing, keep learning, and remember, your next great innovation might be hiding in the tools you're building to solve today's problems. The small cause you're creating right now might be the beginning of something much bigger than you.